apparently some of the Chinese comrades were not happy with Khrushchev's speech, and then that helps to feed ultimately one of the more significant events in the history of the world, which is the schism between Beijing and Moscow, which is in the process of being repaired, alas, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But with the velocity of their consolidation today, you get a glimpse of what might have been post 1956 if that schism had not occurred.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to De Facto. This is episode 6. My name is Anthony Ballas, and I'm here once again with the great Dr. Gerald Horne, John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, author of around 40 books, including his latest, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 through 2000. Welcome back, Dr. Horne. Thanks for joining me once again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Today, we're going to be talking about another book of yours, Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party, which you first published in the early 90s and which I think was re-released in 2020 by International. It's a biography of Benjamin J. Davis Jr., lawyer, athlete, master orator, theorist, writer, editor, politician, Communist Party luminary, first Black communist elected to office in the United States of America. It's also a chronicle of some of the major changes in the Communist Party contemporaneous to or with Davis's tenure as a party leader in Harlem, including, as the title suggests, the struggle against Jim Crow and white supremacy, white chauvinism in the party, and the emergence of the Red Scare during the Cold War years, post-World War II. Davis's political career was, in a sense, bookended by a couple of tumultuous episodes in the history of the party for both internal and external reasons, which Dr. Horne will get into. But I was hoping that we could start actually with a different book of yours, an earlier title as well, Powell versus Alabama, the Scottsboro Nine Boys and American Justice. Dr. Horne, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the social and political backdrop of the 1930s, out of which Ben Davis emerged as a public figure, with the case of Angelo Herndon related to the Scottsboro case and the International Labor Defense and things like that.
Well, first of all, one has to approach the 1930s from the perspective of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the establishment of the Soviet Union, which then had knock-on effects worldwide, not least in terms of the establishment of communist parties worldwide, of course, in the United States of America. And so by the time the 1930s begin to unfold, which happens contemporaneously with the onset of the Great Depression, the economic collapse of capitalism, not least in the United States of America, the rise of fascism, etc., one also sees a heightening of racism and white supremacy. And it's in that context that Benjamin Davis Jr., who was born in the early 20th century to an affluent Black family, a family that in some ways was analogous to the King family, also of Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Davis's hometown, speaking, of course, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And just as a footnote, although I'm getting ahead of myself chronologically, I should mention that in the late 1950s, when Dr. King was stabbed in Harlem, and it was said that if he had sneezed, he would no longer be at the land of the living, to show you how close he was to death. And Benjamin Davis Jr. rushed to the hospital, was able to supply a blood transfusion, leading to the canard that yes, Dr. King had communist blood flowing in his veins. But in any case, Angelo Herndon was a young Communist League organizer in Atlanta, charged with criminal offenses because of his protests against deteriorating economic conditions in Atlanta, Georgia, falsely proclaimed as the city too busy to hate, which is mildly speaking an exaggeration. Benjamin Davis Jr., befitting his affluent background, had matriculated at Amherst College in Massachusetts and Harvard Law School, and was seemingly on the fast track to middle-class respectability when he intervened, so to speak, in the Angelo Herndon case, helping to catapult both Herndon and Davis into a kind of notoriety. It was in that context of fighting against racist repression that Davis joined the Communist Party. It was in that context also that you saw the rise of the importance of the Scottsboro case. As you were lifting those books, I found it interesting that, yes, that older cover on my right, your left, and the latest both refer to the Scottsboro case. And I think that that's important because the Scottsboro case was profoundly important. It marked the effort to internationalize the anti-Jim Crow movement, not unlike the anti-apartheid movement was internationalized in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I think both internationalization efforts were necessary because even though it may conflict with the dewy-eyed histories that we are oftentimes subjected to, the fact is that given the correlation of forces in the United States, which leaned heavily, at least in the settler population, in terms of backing U.S. apartheid, the fact is that U.S. apartheid or Jim Crow needed that global push, needed those global wins and the sails in order to propel the vessel of anti-Jim Crow. And you had during the Scottsboro case, and by the way, for those who may not be familiar, the case ensues in the early 1930s in Scottsboro, Alabama, when 9 Black youth who are hopping trains looking for work were accused falsely and maliciously of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women and are headed on the fast track to execution, which had been the fate of so many before and since, before the International Labor Defense, which was tied to the US Communist Party, which in turn was tied to the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, intervened, and through their international network was able to mobilize protests at US legations and consulates and embassies all over the world, US corporations all over the world. This puts enormous pressure upon the US authorities and also helps to change consciousness amongst Black people, change consciousness amongst US people and people worldwide to the benefit of the anti-Jim Crow movement. The fact that this happens contemporaneously with the rise of a labor movement should not be neglected. That is to say, the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, also with significant Communist Party influence, organizing basic workers in steel, rubber, auto, etc. The analogy is that traditionally the American Federation of Labor, the older labor umbrella, analogously would go into a university and only organize the professors and leave the staff and the cafeteria workers and others to fend for themselves. Whereas the CIO would organize across the board. And using that analogy, would organize professors, staff, cafeteria workers, et cetera, into one big union, which obviously gives the union a more heft and more significance and more ability to struggle on behalf of higher wages and better working conditions, which is oftentimes seen as a major platform for unions generally. So this is the tumultuous context of the 1930s that helps to propel Ben Davis Jr., helps to propel radicalism, helps to propel the Communist Party, helps to propel the case of Angelo Herndon, the case of the Scottsboro Nine, et cetera.
Great. Now, you mentioned that Davis began this trial, the Herndon trial, as an anti-Jim Crow lawyer, but he emerged as a Marxist and a member of the Communist Party. And in this period, and you already mentioned post-Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, in this period, the national question was a central issue for the Communist Party and the Black Belt thesis in particular in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the Black Belt thesis and the way that the question of national self-determination in the American South was central to Davis's work and to the work being done by the Communist Party?
So the Black Belt thesis emerges in the 1920s. There's a lot of controversy about it. Subsequently, when the Communist Party was under attack in the 1950s, their detractors were arguing that it was a prescription for a new Jim Crow, to coin a phrase. And that particular point was made because the Black Belt thesis, among other things, called for self-determination in the Black Belt. The Black Belt being this chain of counties ranging roughly from Virginia down through Dixie as far as Texas. And it was said that this could conceivably be the foundation of a Black nation. Now, the flip side of the Black Belt thesis was that there should be an unrelenting struggle against white supremacy, against white chauvinism, against Jim Crow, et cetera. And that, it seems to me, was the animating importance of the Black Belt thesis, because this was something new, relatively new in the United States. That is to say, to have an organized formation of not just Black people, but people of various ethnicities and so-called racial groupings who were united against white chauvinism and white supremacy. And the struggles were exemplified, as noted, by the Herndon case, the Scottsboro Nine case, et cetera. Now, the Black Belt thesis, there was controversy as well, because internally, particularly amongst the Black comrades, there was not necessarily unanimity with regard to this thesis. But as you know, in a party that organizes on the principle of democratic centralism, there is presumably full and thorough debate, and then a decision is made, and then the comrades are supposed to carry out the decision. And that's basically how it worked with regard to the Black Belt thesis. Now, when I wrote that book, the book that is the subject of our discussion today about the Black Belt, about Ben Davis, I had yet, obviously, if you just look at the chronology, I had yet to do my own research into the origins of the United States of America. And in fact, what's interesting about the U.S. Communist Party is that if you look at the work of Herbert Aptheker, the historian, who I happen to know, that his work on the early history of North America basically begins in the middle of the 18th century. And with all respect to Aptheker, I think that's a little tardy, a little late in terms of understanding what unfolds. I think also in the historiography that was driving the Communist Party, I thought there was insufficient attention to the Native American question, the indigenous question, which helps to explain why the term settler colonialism, which I think is an adequate and accurate descriptor of what unfolds in North America, was generally absent from their discourses. Subsequently, I also did research on Southern Africa. I wrote actually the longest book I've written to this point, deals with the struggles in Southern Africa. It's almost 900 pages. And the Communist Party of South Africa, which in many ways was parallel to the Communist Party of the United States, they came up with this thesis. Well, they came up with a number of theses. One that I'll focus on is that what was unfolding at the southern tip of Africa was colonialism of a special type, where the colonized and the colonizer lived side by side. Now, from my estimation, that's just a description of settler colonialism. And I think that bespeaks some of the ideological weaknesses of the international communist movement at that time. Quite frankly, I think that they tended to overdetermine, to speak euphemistically, the rescue of Europeans who migrated to the southern tip of Africa or who migrated across the Atlantic. And that then leads to an overestimation of what's called the Enlightenment. That is to say, that supposedly the United States was an exemplar of the Enlightenment, so-called, because of its constitution. My own opinion, as I say in my books on the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, is that I think that that's idealism, philosophical idealism. That is to say that you can't, just like you can't understand the Second Amendment, which we're still grappling with in this country, not understanding settler colonialism, the desire to put muskets in the hands of settlers so they could battle the indigenous and keep the Africans in line. You have to look at these so-called bourgeois democratic rights as a kind of combat pay to attract Europeans across the Atlantic. So at some point, someone needs to do a comparative analysis of the success or lack thereof of nations like the Argentine, United States, Canada, in attracting European migrants. And I think that they'll come up with certain revelations in terms of attractions. In any case, I think, obviously, and with 2020 hindsight, that the international communist movement would have been better served with a deeper excavation of the notion of settler colonialism. But alas, history marches, sometimes with twists and turns. I would not have been able to do my work but for the work of others. I'm standing on the shoulders of others. And so this, quote, criticism, unquote, needs to be placed in a context. That is to say that people were enmeshed and involved in struggle, hectic struggle on a day-to-day basis, unable to perhaps properly theorize because the histories that, for example, allowed me to write had not been written as of the 1920s or the 1930s. But in any case, the point I would like to leave your audience with, and I think it's the point that is oftentimes lost sight of, is that the Black Belt thesis notwithstanding, and its real and imagined debilities, should not be allowed to obscure the flip side of the coin, which was a relentless struggle against white supremacy, Jim Crow, white chauvinism. And in fact, to turn around the telescope, it's possible to suggest that the struggles, the actual struggles against white supremacy and Jim Crow and apartheid, in some sense, were more vigorous in the 1930s than they are today. So there you have it. Perhaps today, some of us are more, or think we're more theoretically advanced than the comrades in the 1920s. But on the practical level, in many ways, they were more advanced. And I won't make the next point, which is that the practical level is the ultimate determining factor. I'll leave your audience to sort that one out.
Well, it's a really interesting analysis, and I didn't even think that, as you put it, chronologically, you hadn't gotten to your critique of settler colonialism and the origin of the United States yet after you when you had written this book. So it's really interesting to think about it through that lens of your other analysis. Um, and speaking of the sharpness or the deftness of analysis in the 1930s, going back to Ben Davis as a thinker and a writer, he became the editor of the Daily Worker in, I think, 1935, if I'm not mistaken. And then he goes to Harlem, becomes the editor, and then he makes a bid for city council. In his prison memoir, he describes the press describing him as an impossible candidate, given, of course, that he was essentially doubly handicapped, you might say, being both black and a communist, of course. On the contrary, though, Davis describes these attributes as a double weapon against the ruling class. And essentially against all odds, he establishes a kind of popular front and was elected to office. And with widespread political appeal across the political spectrum, across the class spectrum. And he had tremendous backing and support from celebrities, Lena Horne, Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, Max Roach, Cab Calloway, Joe Louis, his comrade Paul Robeson, and others. And party membership skyrocketed in Harlem during this period. So my question to you, Dr. Horne, is other than his stentorian style and his theoretical sharpness and his verbal wizardry, as you describe, what was it about Davis and his politics that appealed to this kind of united front, which, as you put it in the book, has yet to be rebuilt in the United States?
Well, I think it's a relentless struggle against Jim Crow, which was very important to Black people. Recall that his basic support was in Harlem, which at that point was a sizable Black American constituency with many migrants from the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, for example. Speaking of Trinidad, one of his closest comrades was Claudia Jones, who was born in Trinidad and became a leader of the Communist Party at the same time that Davis was, and also was jailed by the 1950s. And I think that what was happening was that the US ruling class, in a sense, were handing over the Black community on a silver platter to forces on the left, including the Communist Party, who eagerly accepted. What I mean is that since the U.S. ruling class was willing to countenance U.S. apartheid, willing to countenance laws that justified and bolstered U.S. apartheid, they did not have much credibility amongst Black people or for those who were unsympathetic to Jim Crow. And then there are other aspects too that I don't, in retrospect, I could have gone into more detail about, and that is the ability to be a good organizer. The ability to be a good organizer involves many qualities. It involves diplomacy, for example, the ability to bring otherwise warring factions and contradictory elements to the table on common ground. It involves tireless and relentless labor, staying in meetings until the wee hours of the morning, if need be. And also, it involves a mastery of the rules of order. I remember when I was doing political organizing, and I'm sure it's probably in my papers, or perhaps in my contemporary library, is a dog-eared copy of Robert's Rules of Order, which are used to maintain order in meetings. Say if you have a meeting of 1,000 people, obviously it can quickly descend into chaos. That is to say, there might be 1,000 different opinions. And so you need some sort of a structure you need an edifice, you need scaffolding to make sure that such a raucous gathering does not descend into disorder. And that was one of the strengths of the Communist Party. And in fact, just as a historical footnote, I recall I received my first copy of Robert's Rules of Order from the late Ernest DeMaio. I think it's DEMAIO, Italian American labor organizer with the UE, United Electrical Workers, which was one of the few left-leaning unions around when he handed this copy to me, I'm afraid to say more than a half century ago. And I think that was part of the secret sauce, quite frankly, of the Communist Party, setting aside the political line, setting aside political activism, struggling against Jim Crow. And I should also say that given the strength of the Communist Party in numbers, this meant that Ben Davis was bringing something to the table when Adam Clayton Powell, the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, who had been on the New York City Council before Davis, was then ascending to the US Congress, where he was to stay for decades, and Davis was his anointed successor. But this was not just some sort of gift to Davis or the Communist Party. It was recognition that the communists were bringing something to the table, having influence in unions, in particular, in New York City, and able to mobilize on a rapid basis when need be. I should also say that New York City at that time had this system of proportional representation, which I won't explain it here, but of course it's explained in the book, well, which allows for more representation of minor political parties, so-called, or third parties, parties beyond the Democrats and the Republicans, and proportional representation was the mechanism that allowed Davis to be elected to New York City Council in 1943, reelected in 1945, ousted unceremoniously, if not illegally, in 1949, as he and other Communist Party leaders were about to stand trial on the basis of violating the Smith Act, supposedly teaching the overthrow of the United States government by force and violence. As one communist lawyer put it, the formula then was that ML, Marxism-Leninism, the animating philosophy of the US Communist Party, and Davis, ML equals F plus V, force and violence. And that was the formula. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, that not only allowed Davis to be convicted and then jailed, but his comrades as well, across the nation. And matter of fact, across the oceans, because there were similar Smith Act trials in Hawaii. I wrote about that in another book, about how the left and the Communist Party had established probably their strongest foundation in the archipelago in the South Seas, speaking of Hawaii. But the leadership there too was jailed for violating the Smith Act. And so there you have it.
Yeah. Before we get to his time in jail, I think the trial was 1949. He served at Terre Haute, Indiana penitentiary from 51 to 55. Just want to back up just for a second and address one other question about this united front, because in the book I found it kind of striking that you were somewhat critical of the Popular Front style politics espoused by Davis and the Communist Party during this period. Do you consider this? I mean, you've mentioned some of the positive aspects of the United Front in Harlem that Davis established with the backing of the Communist Party. But do you think perhaps too that the party was a bit too open to centrism, centrist influence, perhaps, or too willing to make certain concessions to centrist institutions?
Well, of course, I would, without going into the weeds, I would draw a distinction between Popular Front and United Front politics. But I would say this, that I think, as other historians have pointed out, what happens is that there's a lot of alienation amongst Black people, needless to say. I mean, your ancestors are kidnapped and dragged across the Atlantic to work for free and supposedly work for free in the paragon of human rights and the paragon of human liberty, this efflorescence of the Enlightenment. And part of that philosophy, as I suggested a moment or two ago, was born by the Communist Party. This was part of their ideology. And so the idea that other historians have pointed out is that, to a certain extent, and this may have been unavoidable, that the Communist Party, by recruiting so heavily in the Black community, was recruiting them into that sort of ideology. That is to say, as I've, I have, I have this reader coming out in a few months, in which I reprint a piece I wrote for this online journal, Convergence, where I have to say I'm particularly scathing about that whole process. The point that I make that I think is relevant here, and that piece was written a year or so ago. This book we're talking about came out 30 years ago or so. And I say that fundamentally, the United States became sort of a white nationalist project. In my 1776 book, I call it an apartheid project. And so by recruiting Black people into the Communist Party and then instructing them that the creation of the United States was this great leap forward for humanity, that obviously creates quite a bit of cognitive dissonance on the part of Black comrades. And not only that, but then if some who are attracted to the Communist Party because of the militants with regard to fighting Jim Crow, or because the other parties are so sorely lacking, because lest we forget, the Democrats were captured by the Dixiecrats, the powerful caucus in the South, which were the most vigorous advocates of Jim Crow. The Republicans were hardly any better. So there weren't that many alternatives for Black people who wanted to struggle, who wanted to struggle in united fashion. And so what happens is that if you have Black people who join the Communist Party, they begin to raise objections to what I consider to be this nationalist project, white nationalist project. Then they're denounced in contemporary terms, I would say, but the equivalent of the 1930s and 1940s as being identitarians, captives of identity politics, et cetera, when actually they're objecting to a faulty analysis of history that downplays what befell them, which actually downplays class struggle, interestingly enough, because a phrase that you see that I don't think I critiqued it in the book at hand, and you still see this phrase often about the working class and Black people, although Black people are 95% working class. So it's almost like you excommunicated themselves from the working class. I sort of understand the thinking, but obviously it's faulty. Not only that, but it downplays the fact that slavery was the ultimate class question. I mean, you're talking about unpaid workers struggling under oppressive conditions. That's a class question. And so the inability to see enslavement as a class question, and of course percolates or trickles down to today, leading to a sort of a misapprehension, misunderstanding of the national question, as it used to be called, of the Negro question, as it used to be called. It and of course, ultimately, perhaps not surprisingly, it leads to a sort of cover up of class collaboration amongst those who are allowed to uh, carry the honor of being considered the working class. That is to say, the workers in places like Texas and Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi who consistently vote for the right wing, for example, with hardly any explanation uh, amongst our friends on the left as to why that takes place, except I guess, they're misled, et cetera, very subjective kinds of explanations. In other words, not objective explanations that would explain this phenomenon by dint of a historical materialist point of view, for example. And so it leads to a sort of cover up of settler colonialism, a sort of cover up of white supremacy, which then further alienates Black people and other people who have any sense, which helps to explain why, despite all of the rhetoric about the United States being the epitome of the Enlightenment project, uh, we're on the cusp of a possible fascism. And that particular contradiction is hardly explored either.
Absolutely. And just for reference, the the article that Dr. Horne is describing is called "Against Left-Wing White Nationalism," I believe, and it's was reprinted in Monthly Review last year. You can also find it on Convergence. I believe it's called "The White Republic." Um, and I have a question about Ben Davis and fascism. Actually, closer to the end, because he was kind of prescient on that question. It seemed. But going back to kind of dovetailing with the question of centrism, I guess, in a way, you spent a significant portion of the book covering the era known as Browderism, named after Earl Browder, General Secretary of the Communist Party in the 30s and I think early 40s. Can you explain to the listeners and viewers what Browderism is or was, and what was at stake politically in those years for the party under Earl Browder? How was Davis entangled in this controversy? And ultimately, how was Browderism connected with the emergence of the Red Scare? Because, as you put it in the book, as you argue, Davis was tried essentially for Browderism,
Right.
which is an
For
interesting
revolting against Browderism.
excuse me, for revolting against Browderism, which is a really interesting twist in the book as you're reading it, I should say. But anyway, Dr. Horne, can you talk a little
Well,
bit?
it's a kind of right-wing opportunism. To give you an example, and to also try to paint a broader picture, which I could have done more effectively in this particular book. Uh, the example that's oftentimes given is the reaction to the internment of Japanese Americans from period from 1942 to 1945, the area stretching from Seattle to San Diego. Of course, Japanese Americans were a plurality in the Hawaiian archipelago. They weren't interned there, to show you how opportunistic that policy was by the U.S. authorities. Because if they had been interned, the entire economy would have collapsed. But so what happens is that Black people from Dixie are then attracted to the West Coast. The beginnings of a mass Black population in Los Angeles is during that period, 1942 to 1945, as Little Tokyo becomes Bronzeville. The Communist Party did not bathe itself in glory organizationally in terms of the internment, although individually, you had a number of comrades who protested. And in fact, Carl Yoneda, who was probably the leading Japanese American comrade, he was in California. His spouse, Elaine Black, who was not Japanese American, she enters the internment camp with him. She's a communist leader as well, rather than say stay outside. And you had some leaders of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union as well, headquartered in San Francisco, West Coast Longshore, who were communists who protested vigorously against the internment. But to paint a broader picture, if you look at the NAACP, for example, who you would think would be in the forefront of protesting against this mass violation of civil liberties, because obviously it sets a precedent for internment of Black Americans during a similar national emergency. The NAACP position, generally speaking, was to see how Black people could capitalize on the misery of Japanese Americans. For example, how do you take over their businesses in produce, for example, more so than protesting vigorously? And as I was suggesting a moment or two ago, I think I could have done a better job of painting that broader picture. Because I think what happens is that the United States is so ideologically deficient that it affects all of us to a greater or lesser degree, whether we know it or not. And that was the case in spades in the 1940s. And so this sort of right-wing opportunism of Browderism, which I'm suggesting was manifested with regard to that critical issue, was something that was not unique to the Communist Party alone. That deficiency befell others because I think that the country itself was ideologically deficient. And there's another point too, which is that, as I said in another book, Facing the Rising Sun, Black people were so alienated because of Jim Crow that there was a very powerful pro-Tokyo lobby, that is to say, Imperial Japan lobby, amongst Black Americans. As I say in that book, in November of 1942, in East St. Louis, Illinois, you had Black people in military uniforms engaged in drills, anticipating a Japanese invasion of North America, which they were going to join on behalf of Tokyo, for example. And interestingly enough, the Communist Party was polemicizing, needless to say, against that particular point of view, but were not as vigorous, shall we say, in protesting the internment of Japanese Americans, for example. Now, I spent a lot of time in that book, as I recall, in trying to suggest that even though their critics and detractors were arguing that the Communist Party basically gave up the struggle against Jim Crow during that time, I think that that's an overstatement, shall we say. I don't think that the record necessarily bears that out. But at the same time, I think on the level of generalization, and this is a point I'll make now, being much older, hopefully much wiser and more mature, that any revolutionary force or that even pretends to be revolutionary in the United States really has to guard against right-wing opportunism, which is, I think, an occupational hazard on the left, because I think the country is almost structured to produce right-wing opportunism. It's, as I said, it's no accident that it was not just the Communist Party that fell down on the job in terms of protesting the internment. Others who should have known better also fell down on the job. But in any case, what happens is that at an inopportune moment, inopportune in the sense that you have this very tempestuous moment when World War II is lurching to a close. This is 1944. The war ends in 1945. And you have the French Communist Party leader Jacques Duclos writes polemicizing against a number of Communist Party positions. This piques the interest, shall we say. And I should also say that in 1944, the Communist Party, they thought that they were mimicking the relationship between Washington and Moscow. That is to say, their ability to unite to fight fascism could be an exemplar, suggesting how the working class and the ruling class, the lion could lie down with the lamb and they could unite for a better world. So it's Moscow and Washington had united to fight Imperial Japan and fascism. Likewise, you saw that the Communist International, which was this umbrella organization of communist parties worldwide that sought to coordinate global strategy from headquarters in Moscow, it chose to dissolve during World War II. And so the Communist Party took the hint and moved from being a political party to a political association, and animated by that pre-existing notion that if Washington and Moscow could unite, then classes could unite in the United States, which in a sense is a prescription for class collaboration, a prescription for right opportunism, etc. Jacques Duclos, shortly thereafter, polemicizes against that. That leads to the overthrow of Browder and quite a bit of self-abasement on the part of Communist Party leaders, engaging in self-criticism, apologizing for it. And as you suggested, when the party goes on trial in 1949, part of the gravamen of the case is that by overthrowing Browderism, this is against the law almost. You should go to jail to show you how significant that was. So you could also make the case that, and I can't recall if I made it in that book or another book, that Browderism also animates what I consider to be one of the most profoundly mistaken personnel decisions in the history of the world. When Harry Truman, the anti-Semitic racist senator from Missouri, replaces Henry A. Wallace, who was much more progressive, as FDR's vice president in 1944. Obviously, the ruling class was much more far-sighted because in terms of anticipating Roosevelt's death, I mean, it's one of those what-if situations that I don't like to engage in, but it's unavoidable to speculate on what if Henry Wallace had been vice president, as he had been from 1940 to 1944. What if he had been vice president in 1945? But instead, it was Truman, who then proceeds to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, one of the most egregious examples of mass murder in world history, launches the Red Scare that leads to the routing not only of the Communist Party, but left-leaning unions generally, left-leaning organizations and personalities generally. And one could say that when the Communist Party went along with the replacement of Wallace with Truman, you had many communists thinking that was a neat idea, to quote Oliver North. That was in the midst of this whole Browderism escapade, which, as I said, the two perhaps most horrible examples of Browderism was one, a lack of vigor in protesting the internment of Japanese Americans, the plundering of their property from Seattle to San Diego, and then second, acquiescence to the replacement of Wallace by Truman. There's rarely a good time to make blunders and errors and mistakes. But at that fraught moment, the world is enmeshed in world war and many important decisions having to be made, it's difficult to think of a worse moment to make blunders than 1944 and 1945.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analysis that you offer in the book, bringing these threads together. The Communist Party policy on internment and the selection of political candidates and so on, and how certain mistakes really kind of catapult the party into turmoil as the decade of the 1950s comes to a close, as you already mentioned in 1949 when the party's put on trial. And Davis, among many others, is tried, convicted, jailed. He serves time in the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana until 1955. He is released. And a year later in 56, you treat 1956 as kind of a turning point, another turning point.
Yet another.
Yeah, but a very major turning point in the history of the party. It is the year after Davis is released. Revelations about Stalinism have emerged. The USSR has sent tanks into Hungary. And then Davis and the Communist Party, somewhat weakened by internal turmoil, Browderism, and so on, and this trial, have become the targets, will become the targets of COINTELPRO. And you argue that the FBI really seized the opportunity offered by this conjuncture to actively disrupt the party by various means, some of which I'm sure people are very familiar with: disinformation campaigns, planting evidence, running surveillance, stoking factionalism, and things like that, attempting to disrupt Davis's close relationships, including his marriage, and other such nefarious strategies. Even though in the press, I think you cover this quite well, Davis and the party were seen as very weak, flagging in their influence. The FBI didn't really seem to agree with that diagnosis. And so they were obviously still very concerned that a black-white front could emerge, a black-white-red front could emerge as the struggle for civil rights ushered in the next phase of Black liberation. And as you already mentioned, like a few minutes ago, about half an hour ago, it didn't help that Davis and Martin Luther King had despite their ideological differences, had an intimate rapport, including this episode in 1958 where Davis essentially saves his life through a blood transfusion after King is stabbed in Harlem. So anyway, I want to just talk a little bit about COINTELPRO. In the book, you write that COINTELPRO fed paranoia, helped frighten away a generation from openly leftist ties, while it pushed the United States more toward the right and contributed to jingoism and facilitated the spending of tax dollars on the military rather than on human needs. Now, that sounds like you could have written that about 2023. So I don't know if you want to talk about
Sure.
COINTELPRO in 50s and into the 60s, and then maybe I can ask you a question about our current moment.
Well, what's interesting as you were talking, I was thinking, I'm on a research trip now, and a few days ago I was in Sacramento, looking at the papers of Governor Earl Warren before he becomes head of the U.S. Supreme Court and becomes the architect of the Brown versus Board of Education decision of May 17th, 1954, saying that Jim Crow no longer obtains. As governor, during the Japanese internment, he was a real hawk. And what's interesting is going through his correspondence, what leaves one shaken, at least it left me shaken, this just happened in the last week or so, was just the vitriol, not only towards Japanese Americans, basically a genocidal impulse with regard to so-called Anglo-California writing to the governor. And of course, vitriol directed at the Black population as well, to put it mildly, but also towards the Jewish population. I mean, the anti-Semitism is just breathtaking during that time. And there was the widespread idea, generally fallacious, although I understand why some people accepted this fallacy, was that the Communist Party was dominated by Jewish Americans, and that radicalism was dominated by Jewish Americans. And in that context, the Rosenberg case, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the alleged supposed atomic spies who had supposedly leaked the quote secret of atomic weapons to Moscow, challenging U.S. national security. Of course, I assume you can still find it. If you go to the Progressive magazine from the 70s, they printed the formula to the atomic bomb, in case anybody wanted to make one, I guess. But it's not the formula, is getting the material to construct the bomb. That's important. But to me, the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were, of course, Jewish Americans, was really a shot across the bow at Jewish Americans. Because basically the struggle in the 1950s, that is to say, the agonizing retreat from more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, which is accompanied by a lessening of the more horrible aspects of anti-Semitism. I use the analogy of U.S. policy in Central America and Guatemala during that same period. You know, beans and rifles. That is to say, frijoles y fusiles. That is to say, you accept the beans or you're going to be hit with the rifles. And so the Black people said, you accept these anti-Jim Crow concessions, otherwise you may go to jail or be chased into exile. And likewise for Jewish Americans, you accept this lessening of anti-Semitism, otherwise you might be executed. So, okay, if you put it like that, I think I'll take the money and run. You know, I think I'll take the concessions. And I would say that policy has more or less reached a point of exhaustion. In 2023, I think it reached a point of exhaustion some time ago, but certainly by 2023. And then with regard to Jewish Americans in particular, we get to what I tried to outline in my 16th century book, which is that rather than some sort of enlightenment that leads to more acceptance of Jewish Americans in the North Atlantic corridor, particularly in North America, it's not so much enlightenment as needing all the warm bodies you could rustle up to join militias to subdue the Native Americans and keep the Africans in line. And then with the Haitian Revolution, the complement to that strategy, which is the race issue, a mass unpaid labor force begins to lose resonance with the overthrow of the regime by unpaid workers. And then the forced retreat from Jim Crow by the 1950s. And without a really sort of honest or exhaustive struggle against anti-Jewish fervor, anti-Semitism. So inevitably, it seems to me it begins to resurge as it's doing now. Because the United States has oftentimes been described as the headquarters of pragmatism, and that's oftentimes seen as a compliment, but pragmatism, if you look at it philosophically and historically, it's not the sort of philosophy that's going to necessarily guarantee progressive results consistently. Because oftentimes pragmatism is based upon opportunism. As I said, opportunism is one of the occupational hazards that we face in trying to transform this erstwhile settler colonial regime. So that's part of the background that leads to Davis and the Communist Party being subjected to Smith Act trials, leadership jailed from Hawaii to New York, in the midst of tempestuous change with the Khrushchev speech at the Party Congress in 1956. For years, communists have been dismissing allegations about Stalin's rule, and how now you had the party secretary basically saying that you should not have dismissed these allegations. Interestingly enough, as some specialists have written, this also has knock-on effects in China, because apparently some of the Chinese comrades were not happy with Khrushchev's speech, and then that helps to feed ultimately one of the more significant events in the history of the world, which is the schism between Beijing and Moscow, which is in the process of being repaired, alas, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But with the velocity of their consolidation today, you get a glimpse of what might have been post 1956 if that schism had not occurred. You also have COINTELPRO, as you suggest, which starts initially with the Communist Party, but then ultimately leads to a crackdown on the Black Liberation Movement, the Native American movement, other movements. It helps to stultify progressivism in the United States, particularly from the radical left, for years to come, leading to the rise of this very powerful right-wing movement in the United States, which we still have to grapple with. And then there are allied issues as well, such as the Suez Crisis. That is to say, London, Paris, and Israel attacking Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal, Nasser being the leader of Egypt at that time, and being forced to stand down, not only by Moscow, which is quite threatening in that context, but also by the United States. Because the United States at that particular moment has a very curious relationship to its erstwhile European allies, sort of patting them on the back with one hand and picking their pocket with the other. The United States, particularly when Kennedy comes into office by 1960, sees that there's ground to be gained by appearing to be anti-colonial in Africa. For example, Kennedy's position on the Algerian question, which had thrown France into chaos as it sought to keep control of its North African colony unsuccessfully, leading to assassination attempts against Charles de Gaulle, the Algerian independence in 1962. And so President Eisenhower in 1956 also comes out against this piratical attack. London draws the conclusion that it should tie itself closer to Uncle Sam's apron strings, where it still finds itself in 2023, while France decides that Uncle Sam is unreliable. And if you look at the history of France, you'll see, I make this point in my 16th century book, at a time of the conflict between the Protestant and Catholic powers, Protestant London versus the Iberian Catholics. France was predominantly Catholic at that time. But just like in the 20th century, it's not necessarily going to go along with its Catholic comrades. And so likewise, in the a la the 16th century, France did not necessarily want to go along with the leader of the imperialist camp. So it tries to embark on a sort of alternative position within NATO, where it withdraws from the military wing for a while of NATO. You just saw the most dramatic expression of that recently with President Macron, pardon my French, as they say in the United States, when he returns from his trip to China just a few weeks ago, says that France needs to build an alternative European pole, not necessarily go along with Uncle Sam. And that was his position in 1956. France recognizes China well before the United States does. So that's I guess what I'm saying as well is that part of the value of communist parties, theoretically, is their theoretical approach, which has many facets, but let me just say organizationally, it involves democratic centralism, which you see in African liberation movements. If you look at Zimbabwe, I wrote a book about Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF, the ruling party, its organizational structure basically mimics communist parties. They have a central committee, a political bureau, democratic centralism, et cetera. That's part of the legacy of these communist parties, but also part of the legacies is doing a political assessment, not to just charge into battle wildly, but to look at the forces on the ground. And I mean, for example, if you were to do a political assessment about the United States today and trying to gauge the strength of the right and the potential for the left, You look at the Chicago mayor's race, just elected the most left-leaning mayor perhaps in Chicago's history. Wisconsin Supreme Court election where the right was defeated. The defeat of Fox News in the defamation case. There are other signs of a possible turn. But even if there's not, as a Communist Party, you're supposed to make an assessment of political conditions, political forces, and then come up with a strategic political line to advance the struggle and take advantage of that. And just from what I've said the last few minutes with COINTELPRO, Khrushchev, Suez, I mean, a lot of things are going on at that particular moment. And you have leadership coming out of prison, where oftentimes they were deprived of the news, not necessarily up to speed. And I haven't even mentioned the Black Liberation Movement, or I did mention in the context of this beans and rifles strategy, where the U.S. ruling class has this a very slick strategy of offering concessions or prison. And for many people, that makes for an easy choice. You take the concessions, which then means you try to steer clear of communist parties, which the NAACP did, which was something that was intermittently part of their strategy and philosophy going back to the 1930s, but took off with jet propulsion in the 1950s. This, of course, creates problems for Martin Luther King Jr., not only because of his pre-existing relation with Ben Davis Jr., but also because of his relationship with Jack Odell, who had been a communist member of the National Maritime Union, a left-leaning union of that era, and Jack becomes King's chief aide until JFK invites King into the Rose Garden to escape the surveillance of the FBI and tells King to get rid of Jack. King agrees, but then he tries to keep subterranean relationships with him, which then leads to further problems for King. Jack goes on, of course, to be an architect of Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns in the 1980s, but also an editor of Freedom Waves magazine. And when King comes out against the Vietnam War, his speech or his remarks are printed in Freedom Waves, which is this communist-led journal, which is sort of a popular front led by communists, but incorporating Lorraine Hansberry, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, and Alice Walker, and James Baldwin, Ossie Davis, the late actor, writer, activist, etc. So I say all this to say that this is a very confusing political moment. It would have tested the mettle of any communist party, but the Communist Party was disadvantaged not only because the leadership was coming out of prison, but also one of their constituencies, the Black community, was somewhat disoriented and discombobulated by this beans and rifles strategy, which helps to sort of cleave and split that constituency. And then all of that then creates an ideological vacuum leading to the rise of the Nation of Islam, which had been during the war, World War II, one of the more significant pro-Tokyo formations. The leadership served in prison because of that. But with all of these changes that I'm talking about and the ideological vacuum created, they begin to rise as well, which then in turn creates issues with the Jewish leadership, which then bleeds over into the Communist Party. It's a very complicated, complex political scenario. I think Black people, and this is a lesson that needs to be ingested even today, instinctively have felt that organizations should be international. And I think that that's why you had so much Black sympathy for the Communist Party up into the Red Scare. Because it was an international movement. Communist parties all over the world. And then when the Communist Party is bludgeoned, you have the rise of the Nation of Islam, which is, in a sense, an international movement. Islam is, you saw that President Erdogan, predominantly a Muslim country, Turkey, just reelected. The Nation of Islam developed relations with Libya, with the Saudis, for example. So even though some of the liberals, they still try to tell us, well, the problem with the communists was this internationalism. Well, it depends on which constituency you're talking about. And I think that because there's an unhealthy skepticism in Black America about the bona fides of the United States and the Euro-Americans across class lines, that they feel to countervail that, you need support from abroad. So the United States, fine. You clip the wings of the Communist Party, now you can deal with the Nation of Islam. So, you know, that take your pick.
Oh, very good. That's all really, really elucidating the text even more for me. I have one final question if you've got time, Dr. Horne.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
All right. You made this parallel between 1956 and 2023 with regard to France and China and Moscow. And you said we're kind of getting a glimpse of what post-56 Sino-Soviet relations could have been. And I find that really interesting. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask this final question, and it has to do with Davis. And he often warned, as you put it in the book, of the emergence of a fascism going this far back during the war, but also after the war, speaking of World War II. Although some saw it as a bit of an overstatement in the 40s and 50s after the defeat of Hitler, it seems that history has vindicated Davis, and that his warning is perhaps more prescient and applies more today to our present political crisis than it ever did in his own lifetime, possibly. And we're seeing the reemergence of a Red Scare, Black Scare political formation. And we're, as you mentioned, as we've talked about numerous times on this show, we're seeing a burgeoning U.S. fascism, particularly in states like Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Arkansas, and of course, the subject of your latest book, Washington, D.C., with the attempted coup of January 6th and so on. There have been book bans, laws banning critical race theory. We're witnessing a Red Scare at international scale, as indicated by the bipartisan anti-China fervor, hysteria around the rise of BRICS. House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning the horrors of socialism, which was received bipartisan support, unsurprisingly. We've seen the offices raided and the indictment of several members of the African People's Socialist Party, which was, I believe, headquartered in Florida. Was it not the same week as the raid, as Mar-a-Lago was raided, which is kind of interesting? And the indictment of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who was indicted on similar charges as those charged to Ben Davis in 1949. And then finally, Senator Rick Scott issued a travel advisory for socialists, warning them not to travel to Florida under the threat of bodily harm or death, citing immigrants from people who have immigrated from Central and South American countries to Florida, being possible antagonists to socialists who may travel to certain parts of Florida. So anyway, the list goes on and on. So in closing, Dr. Horne, what lessons can we learn from Ben Davis, other than the ones you've already explicated for us, as to how we might combat this rise of this admixture, I guess, of fascism, a new Red Scare, both of which are accelerating ever more today? How can Davis's legacy inform us and help us fix perhaps what you describe in the book as, and you've already spoken to this, the underdeveloped political culture of the United States?
Well, you know, it's interesting. What you've just done is a kind of assessment, which is part of the legacy of not only Communist Party of the United States and Ben Davis, but communist parties worldwide. I mean, you laid out an entire litany of factors that needs to be taken into account before you develop strategy. And of course, in my preceding remarks, I mentioned points from the other side of the ledger, Chicago, Wisconsin, the Fox News judgment. And then, of course, it becomes the task of radicals and progressives to determine which tendency is ascendant, which tendency might be regressing. And irrespective of the conclusion that's arrived at, it seems to me that what we're missing in the United States right now, and this is part of the legacy of Davis and his halcyon days, is more organized. More, as I said some moments ago, he's catapulted into prominence during a major CIO organizing drive of the 1930s that helps to prepare the battlefield for the rise of the Scottsboro case, for example. So we need more organizing. We need more organizing of unions, more organizing of tenants unions, student unions, anti-repression organizations, anti-repression movements, for example. We particularly need more organizing in Dixie. The Communist Party used to have a Southern Solidarity assessment, where if you were in Detroit or Boston, you paid an assessment to go into a kitty for organizing in Dixie. The NAACP had something similar. I'm doing this project on Southern California right now, and there was an assessment for members in Southern California to go into organizing in Dixie, for example. So I said in my Texas book that Texas was to the United States as the United States was to the world, just like the United States drags the world to the right through wars of aggression and the like, and then Texas drives the United States to the right through the death penalty, for example, where it has been a leader, and in terms of women's reproductive freedom, for example, where it has been an unfortunate leader. So obviously the whole concept of Southern solidarity needs to be revived. Some of these folks in the South, I've come to find that, believe it or not, they get resentful when you speak of the South as being backwards. I guess they think it reflects on them. But I mean, you can live in a backward region and not necessarily be backward yourself. And you shouldn't be engaged in an apologia for a backward region. I mean, I still get irked by this idea that I guess a weird sort of Texas patriotism means you can't call out Texas on the national stage. It's almost like if you're calling out your grandparents on a national stage or something equally ridiculous or ludicrous. But anyway,
they don't have any understanding of self-criticism.
I guess not. But we have a difficult uphill climb, but I'm reasonably confident that we can overcome and prevail.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for donating your time to us once again here. Pick up this book. It's incredible. Just like the Lawrence Dennis book, I'm surprised this has not been made into a film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you.
Of Ben Davis is incredible, riveting read. Dr. Horne, before you leave, you were giving a lecture on your new book.
June 3rd, 2023, Washington, D.C. Go to the website of WPFW-FM.org. WPFW is the Pacifica radio affiliate in Washington, D.C. It's a fundraiser for WPFW. Go to WPFW.WPFWFM.org to get the details. 6 to 9, June 3rd, Adams Morgan District of Washington, D.C.
And I'll make sure to put a link to that in the description. And then finally, you have a book coming out in a couple months, edited by Tian Aliyah Paris, which is called I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader by Or Books. Do you have any idea when that's coming out?
Probably by the fall.
Okay. I want to know so I can review it.
Of course. And then your friend Chris Steele and I have a book coming out too.
That's right. Yeah.
Conversations.
Very exciting. A lot of stuff going on. A lot of stuff to look forward to.
Right on.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Horne. It's always great. I wish you well.